The historical trajectory of the mid-19th century in the United States was defined by a widening systemic divergence between the industrializing North and the agrarian South, a period characterized by legislative attempts to balance the existential threat of sectionalism against the preservation of the Union. In the year 1850, the national landscape was fraught with the consequences of the Mexican-American War and the vast territorial acquisitions that followed, forcing the United States Congress into a protracted debate regarding the status of slavery in the newly organized lands. Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky, alongside Daniel Webster and Stephen A. Douglas, engineered the Compromise of 1850, a series of 5 separate bills intended to diffuse a 4-year political confrontation between slave and free states. This legislative package included the admission of California as a free state, the organization of the Utah and New Mexico territories under the principle of popular sovereignty, and the enactment of a more stringent Fugitive Slave Act. The latter provision proved particularly inflammatory in the northern states, as it compelled citizens to assist in the capture of runaway slaves and denied the accused the right to a jury trial, thereby radicalizing previously moderate abolitionist circles and increasing the activity of the Underground Railroad. Concurrently, the social fabric of the American South was increasingly reliant on the cultivation of short staple cotton, a development made possible by Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which had solidified the economic necessity of enslaved labor in the eyes of the planter class. By 1852, the publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin further shifted the cultural discourse, presenting a serialized narrative of the moral horrors of slavery that reached a massive international audience, much to the consternation of Southern intellectuals who responded with anti-Tom literature defending the institution as a paternalistic necessity. The political stability of the era was further eroded by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, introduced by Stephen A. Douglas, which effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820 by allowing settlers in those territories to determine the legality of slavery through popular vote. This act led to the immediate collapse of the Whig Party and the subsequent rise of the Republican Party, a coalition of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and anti-slavery Democrats committed to preventing the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. The resulting violence in Kansas, often referred to as Bleeding Kansas, served as a localized precursor to the broader conflict, as pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri and anti-slavery free staters engaged in a series of skirmishes, raids, and electoral frauds. This period also witnessed the 1857 Supreme Court decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford, in which Chief Justice Roger B. Taney ruled that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not be citizens of the United States, and that Congress lacked the authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, a ruling that further invalidated the Missouri Compromise and deepened the constitutional crisis. In the late 1850s, the economic panic of 1857 struck the North particularly hard, while the South remained relatively insulated due to high global demand for cotton, reinforcing a false sense of Southern economic superiority and independence. As the 1860 presidential election approached, the Democratic Party fractured along sectional lines during their conventions in Charleston and Baltimore, leading to the nomination of 2 separate candidates, Stephen A. Douglas for the Northern Democrats and John C. Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats. The Republican Party, meeting in Chicago, selected Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, a moderate whose 1858 debates with Douglas had gained him national prominence, specifically his House Divided speech, which argued that the Union could not permanently endure half slave and half free. Lincoln's victory in November 1860, achieved without a single electoral vote from the South, served as the immediate catalyst for South Carolina's legislature to call a convention which unanimously passed an ordinance of secession on December 20, 1860, arguing that the contract between the states had been violated by the northern states' failure to uphold the Fugitive Slave Act. By February 1861, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had joined South Carolina in forming the Confederate States of America, drafting a constitution that explicitly protected the institution of slavery and appointing Jefferson Davis as their provisional president. During the lame duck period of James Buchanan's presidency, federal efforts to reinforce coastal forts in the South were met with increasing hostility, particularly at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, where Major Robert Anderson moved his small command from the vulnerable Fort Moultrie to the more defensible island fortification. The Crittenden Compromise, a final attempt at a constitutional amendment to protect slavery south of the 36° 30th parallel, failed to gain traction in a Congress now dominated by Republicans. Upon his inauguration on March 4, 1861, Lincoln's address was a careful balance of conciliation and firmness, asserting that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed, but maintaining that the Union was perpetual and that he would hold, occupy, and possess federal property. The standoff at Fort Sumter reached its breaking point in April, when Confederate General P.G. Beauregard opened fire after the Lincoln administration attempted to resupply the garrison with provisions only, marking the formal commencement of hostilities and prompting Lincoln to call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, a move that pushed the upper South states of Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee into the Confederacy. The transition from political crisis to total war in the spring and summer of 1861 necessitated an immediate and unprecedented mobilization of American resources, infrastructure, and manpower, as both the Union and the newly formed Confederacy grappled with the logistical realities of a prolonged conflict. Following the fall of Fort Sumter, the strategic focus shifted to the border states of Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, whose geographical positions and industrial capacities were vital to the Union's survival. Lincoln's suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in Maryland was a pragmatic, if legally contentious measure to ensure that the federal capital at Washington, D.C. was not isolated by secessionist sympathizers. The mobilization effort in the North benefited from a superior railroad network comprising approximately 22,000 miles of track and a diverse industrial base capable of producing the rifled muskets such as the Springfield Model 1861 and the heavy artillery required for modern siege warfare. Conversely, the Confederacy, while possessing a smaller rail network of 9,000 miles and limited manufacturing, relied on the tactical advantage of defending interior lines and the hope that King Cotton diplomacy would compel European powers, specifically Great Britain and France, to grant formal recognition and naval support. By July 1861, public and political pressure for a decisive engagement led to the First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, where Union Brigadier General Irvin McDowell's Army of Northeastern Virginia collided with Confederate forces under Generals Joseph E. Johnston and P.G. Beauregard. The chaotic Union retreat to Washington disabused the public of the notion of a short, bloodless war and led to the appointment of Major General George McClellan, who began the methodical task of organizing the Army of the Potomac into a disciplined fighting force. During this period of reorganization, the Union Navy commenced the Anaconda Plan, a long-term maritime strategy proposed by General Winfield Scott, involving a total blockade of the southern coastline to sever Confederate commerce and the eventual seizure of the Mississippi River to bisect the Confederacy. This naval strategy saw early success with the capture of Hatteras Inlet in North Carolina and Port Royal in South Carolina, providing the blockade fleet with essential coaling stations. In the Western Theater, the struggle for control of the river systems became the primary operational objective, leading to the rise of Ulysses S. Grant, whose capture of Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River in February 1862 forced the Confederate withdrawal from Kentucky and much of Middle Tennessee. The subsequent Battle of Shiloh in April 1862 served as a stark indicator of the war's escalating lethality, resulting in over 23,000 combined casualties and demonstrating that the Confederate forces in the West, despite the loss of General Albert Sidney Johnston, remained a formidable threat.
In the East, McClellan's Peninsula Campaign of 1862 sought to bypass the Confederate overland defenses by transporting the Army of the Potomac via the Chesapeake Bay to the Virginia Peninsula, moving toward Richmond from the southeast. This operation was met with logistical delays and cautious maneuvering, allowing Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia after Joseph Johnston was wounded at Seven Pines, to launch a series of aggressive counteroffensives known as the 7 Days Battles. Lee's ability to seize the initiative forced McClellan to retreat to the James River, effectively ending the threat to Richmond for the time being and shifting the theater of operations back toward northern Virginia. The Confederate victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run in August 1862 further emboldened Lee to initiate his first invasion of the North, entering Maryland with the goals of gathering supplies, influencing the upcoming Union midterm elections, and potentially securing foreign intervention. The resulting Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, remains the bloodiest single day in American military history, and while tactically inconclusive, the Confederate retreat gave President Lincoln the political leverage to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order, framed as a fit and necessary war measure, declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states would be thenceforward and forever free, as of January 1, 1863. This shift fundamentally altered the character of the war, transforming it from a struggle for the restoration of the Union into a revolutionary crusade for the abolition of slavery, which effectively precluded British and French intervention on behalf of the Confederacy due to the strong anti-slavery sentiments of their respective populations. The late months of 1862 were marked by the Union's disastrous defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg, where General Ambrose Burnside's repeated frontal assaults against entrenched Confederate positions on Marye's Heights resulted in heavy losses, further demoralizing the Northern public and complicating the political landscape for the Lincoln administration as they prepared for the third year of the conflict. The year 1863 opened with the formal implementation of the Emancipation Proclamation, a decree that not only redefined the Union's war aims, but also authorized the enrollment of African American soldiers into the federal armed forces, leading to the establishment of the Bureau of Colored Troops and the eventual service of approximately 180,000 black men. In the Eastern Theater, General Joseph Hooker, having replaced Burnside, reorganized the Army of the Potomac, but suffered a significant tactical defeat at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863, where Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson executed a daring flank maneuver that overcame a much larger Union force. However, the victory was tempered by the accidental mortal wounding of Jackson by his own men. Following this success, Lee initiated his second invasion of the North, moving through the Shenandoah Valley into Pennsylvania, which culminated in the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863. This engagement, the largest of the war, saw the Union Army of the Potomac, now under General George G. Meade, hold a defensive line along Cemetery Ridge and Culp's Hill against repeated Confederate assaults, including the disastrous frontal attack known as Pickett's Charge on the final day. Simultaneously, in the Western Theater, Ulysses S. Grant concluded a months-long campaign against the Gibraltar of the Confederacy with the Siege of Vicksburg, forcing the surrender of General John C. Pemberton's army on July 4, 1863. The dual victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg represented a definitive strategic shift, granting the Union total control over the Mississippi River and ending the Confederate capacity for sustained offensive operations in the North. Despite these setbacks, the Confederacy maintained a stubborn defense, notably at the Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863, where Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee achieved a rare tactical victory that forced Union forces under William Rosecrans to retreat into Chattanooga. The subsequent siege of Chattanooga was broken in November by Grant, who had been promoted to command of the Military Division of the Mississippi, through a series of assaults on Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, thereby opening the gateway to the Deep South. In early 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to Lieutenant General and General-in-Chief of all Union armies, initiating a strategy of simultaneous coordinated pressure across all fronts to prevent the Confederacy from shifting its dwindling resources between theaters. Grant accompanied the Army of the Potomac into the Overland Campaign, a brutal war of attrition through the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor, which, despite heavy Union casualties, successfully pinned Lee's forces against the defensive works of Richmond and Petersburg. While the siege of Petersburg settled into a protracted trench warfare scenario that prefigured the combat of the 20th century, William Tecumseh Sherman launched the Atlanta Campaign, navigating the mountainous terrain of northern Georgia and engaging in a series of flanking maneuvers against Joseph E. Johnston and later John Bell. The fall of Atlanta in September 1864 provided a critical boost to Northern morale and ensured the re-election of Abraham Lincoln over Democratic challenger McClellan, who ran on a platform advocating for a negotiated peace. Following the capture of Atlanta, Sherman embarked on his March to the Sea, a campaign of psychological and economic warfare designed to destroy the South's infrastructure and its civilian population's will to continue the struggle, culminating in the capture of Savannah in December 1864. In the Shenandoah Valley, Philip Sheridan conducted a similar scorched earth policy, defeating Jubal Early's forces and eliminating the valley as a breadbasket for Lee's army. By the spring of 1865, the Confederate lines at Petersburg finally collapsed under the weight of Union numerical and logistical superiority, forcing Lee to evacuate Richmond and flee westward in a desperate attempt to join forces with Johnston in North Carolina. This retreat was intercepted by Union cavalry and infantry at Appomattox Courthouse, where on April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Grant, effectively signaling the end of the organized military resistance of the Confederacy, though scattered units would continue to surrender throughout the following months. The period of active combat transitioned into the early uncertain phases of Reconstruction, a process complicated by the assassination of President Lincoln on April 14, 1865, by John Wilkes Booth, which elevated Vice President Andrew Johnson to the presidency and initiated a decade of intense constitutional and social struggle over the status of the former Confederate states and the rights of the 4 million newly emancipated individuals.
The assassination of Abraham Lincoln shifted the responsibility of national reunification to Andrew Johnson, a former senator from Tennessee and a war Democrat, whose approach to Reconstruction prioritized the rapid restoration of civil government in the South with minimal federal interference in the social hierarchy. Johnson's program of presidential reconstruction, implemented during the congressional recess of 1865, granted broad amnesties to former Confederates and allowed the Southern states to form new governments which promptly enacted Black Codes, a series of restrictive laws designed to compel freedmen to work in a labor economy based on low wages or death and to deny them basic civil rights, such as the right to testify against whites or serve on juries. This resurgence of Southern defiance led to the emergence of the radical Republicans in Congress, led by figures such as Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania and Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who argued that the executive branch had overstepped its authority and that the South must be fundamentally restructured to ensure the protection of the formerly enslaved population. In 1866, over Johnson's veto, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act and the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, marking the first time in American history that a major piece of legislation was passed over a presidential veto and establishing a precedent for federal intervention in state affairs to protect individual rights. The subsequent ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868 provided a constitutional guarantee of citizenship and equal protection under the law, effectively nullifying the Dred Scott decision. The tension between the executive and legislative branches reached a climax with the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided the South into 5 military districts under the command of Union generals and required states to ratify the 14th Amendment and grant voting rights to black men before they could be readmitted to the Union. This era of congressional or radical Reconstruction saw the rise of a new political coalition in the South, comprising scalawags, Southern whites who supported the Republican Party, carpetbaggers, Northerners who moved south for economic or political reasons, and newly enfranchised African Americans who won election to local, state, and national offices, including the first black U.S. Senators Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce of Mississippi. However, this period also saw the rise of domestic terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, which used violence and intimidation to suppress Republican voting and reestablish white supremacy. The impeachment of Andrew Johnson in 1868, though it fell 1 vote short of conviction in the Senate, significantly weakened the presidency and paved the way for the election of Ulysses S. Grant, whose administration oversaw the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, prohibiting the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Despite the passage of the Enforcement Acts to combat Klan violence, Northern public support for Reconstruction began to wane in the 1870s due to the Panic of 1873, a severe economic depression that shifted the national focus toward financial issues and labor unrest. The gradual redemption of the South followed, as white Democratic redeemers used a combination of paramilitary force and electoral fraud to retake control of state governments, a process that culminated in the disputed presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. The resulting Compromise of 1877 awarded the presidency to Hayes in exchange for the withdrawal of the last remaining federal troops from South Carolina and Louisiana, effectively ending federal enforcement of Reconstruction and allowing for the implementation of Jim Crow laws and the systematic disenfranchisement of black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. As the focus of the nation moved away from the sectional conflicts of the 19th century, the nation entered the Gilded Age, an era of rapid industrialization, urbanization, and the expansion of the transcontinental railroad system, which facilitated the settlement of the Great Plains and the final displacement of indigenous populations. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862 and the Homestead Act had already laid the groundwork for this westward expansion, leading to the construction of the first transcontinental railroad, completed at Promontory Summit, Utah in 1869. This technological achievement integrated the American economy, but led to a series of brutal conflicts known as the Indian Wars, including the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where a coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces defeated the U.S. 7th Cavalry, and the later tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1890, which marked the end of organized armed resistance by Native American tribes. By the late 19th century, the United States had transformed from a collection of agricultural regions into a burgeoning industrial power, with the growth of massive corporations and trusts in industries such as steel, oil, and finance, led by figures like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, whose wealth and influence sparked new debates over the role of government in regulating the economy and protecting the rights of workers who were increasingly organizing into unions like the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. The consolidation of industrial capital during the final decades of the 19th century established a new socioeconomic order, often characterized by the tension between unprecedented material progress and profound social inequality.
As the American frontier was officially declared closed by the Census Bureau in 1890, the nation's economic center of gravity shifted decisively toward urban manufacturing centers, where the Second Industrial Revolution was driven by advancements in steel production, the refinement of petroleum, and the widespread application of electrical power. The Bessemer process, which allowed for the mass production of high-quality steel, provided the structural basis for the expansion of the railroad network and the vertical growth of cities through the construction of skyscrapers, while the inventions of Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla revolutionized both industrial productivity and domestic life. This period saw the rise of the robber barons or captains of industry, such as Cornelius Vanderbilt in shipping and railroads, J.P. Morgan in finance, and John D. Rockefeller, whose Standard Oil Trust controlled nearly 90% of the nation's oil refining capacity by 1880 through aggressive horizontal integration and predatory pricing strategies. The legal environment of the era was largely defined by the doctrine of laissez-faire and the judicial application of the 14th Amendment to protect corporate personhood rather than the civil rights of individuals, as seen in the 1886 Supreme Court case of Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. However, the concentration of wealth led to a reactive movement among the working class and the agrarian population. The Granger movement and the subsequent farmers' alliances evolved into the People's Party, or Populists, who in their 1892 Omaha platform called for the nationalization of railroads, a graduated income tax, and the free coinage of silver to increase the money supply and alleviate the debt of farmers. In the urban North, the labor movement faced violent suppression, as evidenced by the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Affair in 1886, which linked the labor cause with anarchism in the public imagination, and the Homestead Strike of 1892, where Pinkerton agents engaged in a pitched battle with striking steelworkers. The Pullman Strike of 1894 further demonstrated the federal government's willingness to intervene on behalf of capital, as President Grover Cleveland dispatched federal troops to ensure the delivery of the mail, effectively breaking the American Railway Union led by Eugene V. Debs. This era of internal industrial friction was accompanied by a shift in American foreign policy from isolationism towards a burgeoning imperialism, influenced by Alfred Thayer Mahan's thesis on the necessity of sea power for national greatness. The Spanish-American War of 1898, sparked by the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor and fueled by the yellow journalism of Hearst and Pulitzer, resulted in a swift American victory and the acquisition of an overseas empire, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, as well as the de facto protectorate of Cuba under the Platt Amendment. The annexation of Hawaii in 1998 further secured American interests in the Pacific, providing a strategic coaling station for the trek toward the markets of China, which the United States sought to access through the open door policy formulated by Secretary of State John Hay. By the turn of the century, the assassination of William McKinley elevated Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency, ushering in the Progressive Era, a period of widespread social activism and political reform aimed at addressing the externalities of industrialization. Roosevelt's Square Deal sought to balance the interests of labor and capital through federal regulation, exemplified by the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, and the aggressive use of the Sherman Antitrust Act to dismantle monopolies like the Northern Securities Company. This reformist spirit extended to the conservation of natural resources, the advocacy for women's suffrage by leaders like Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt, and the pursuit of social justice through the Settlement House movement led by Jane Addams.
Simultaneously, the African American community faced the nadir of American race relations under the separate but equal doctrine established by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, leading to a divergence in leadership strategies between Booker T. Washington's emphasis on vocational education and economic self-reliance and W.E.B. Du Bois' demand for immediate political equality and the pursuit of higher education for the talented 10th, a conflict that informed the founding of the NAACP in 1909. As the administration of William Howard Taft succeeded Roosevelt, the Republican Party began to fracture between its conservative and progressive wings, a rift that allowed Woodrow Wilson to secure the presidency in 1912 on a new freedom platform that prioritized tariff reduction, banking reform through the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and the strengthening of antitrust laws with the Clayton Antitrust Act, all occurring as the geopolitical stability of Europe began to deteriorate toward the precipice of global conflict. The escalation of international tensions in 1914, following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, initially saw the United States maintaining a policy of strict neutrality under President Woodrow Wilson, who urged the American public to be impartial in thought as well as action. However, the logistical and financial realities of the Great War gradually pulled the United States toward the Allied cause, as American banks, led by the House of J.P. Morgan, issued massive loans to Great Britain and France, and American manufacturers became the primary suppliers of munitions and foodstuffs for the Entente powers. The maritime landscape became increasingly hazardous due to the German Empire's deployment of undersea boots, or U-boats, to enforce a naval blockade around the British Isles. The sinking of the RMS Lusitania in May 1815, which resulted in the deaths of 128 Americans, sparked a diplomatic crisis that briefly forced Germany to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare. This uneasy peace was shattered in early 1917 when Germany, desperate to break the British blockade, announced the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare against all vessels in the war zone, followed shortly by the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, a coded message from the German Foreign Office proposing a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. These provocations led the United States to declare war on April 6, 1917, necessitating a massive bureaucratic and social mobilization effort managed by the Wilson administration through agencies like the War Industries Board under Bernard Baruch and the Committee on Public Information under George Creel, the latter of which was responsible for a vast pro-war propaganda campaign. To raise the necessary manpower, Congress passed the Selective Service Act of 1917, while the financial burden of the war was met through the sale of Liberty bonds and the implementation of the first significant graduated income tax following the ratification of the 16th Amendment. Domestic dissent was suppressed through the passage of the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which led to the imprisonment of anti-war activists such as Eugene V. Debs and were upheld by the Supreme Court in Schenck v. United States under the clear and present danger doctrine. The American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, commanded by General John J. Pershing, arrived in Europe as a distinct and independent force, playing a crucial role in halting the German spring offensive of 1918, at the battles of Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood, and later leading the massive Meuse-Argonne offensive that shattered the Hindenburg Line and forced Germany to sign an armistice on November 11, 1918. In the aftermath of the conflict, Wilson traveled to the Paris Peace Conference with his 14 points, a blueprint for a post-war order based on national self-determination, freedom of the seas, and the establishment of a League of Nations to ensure collective security. However, the resultant Treaty of Versailles focused heavily on German reparations and territorial concessions, and upon Wilson's return to the United States, he faced a recalcitrant Senate led by Henry Cabot Lodge, who feared that the League of Nations would compromise American sovereignty and entangle the nation in perpetual foreign conflicts. The Senate's eventual rejection of the treaty and the League marked a significant retreat into isolationism, coinciding with a period of intense domestic turmoil known as the Red Scare, fueled by the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and a wave of anarchist bombings that led to the Palmer raids and the mass deportation of suspected radicals. This reactionary climate was further complicated by the Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to the industrial North,
which led to increased racial tensions and the violent Red Summer of 1919. Despite these social fractures, the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 finally secured the right to vote for women, a milestone that occurred as the nation transitioned into the return to normalcy promised by the 1920 election of Warren Harding. The 1920s, or the Roaring Twenties, were defined by a dramatic shift toward consumerism and mass culture, fueled by the proliferation of the automobile, particularly Henry Ford's Model T, which revolutionized manufacturing through the assembly line and transformed American geography and social habits. The decade saw the rise of the radio and the motion picture industry, which created a shared national experience, while the prohibition of alcohol under the 18th Amendment led to the rise of organized crime syndicates such as that of Al Capone in Chicago and the proliferation of speakeasies. The cultural landscape was also defined by the Harlem Renaissance, a flourishing of African American literature, music, and art, and the lost generation of writers like F.C. Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, who critiqued the perceived emptiness of post-war materialism. Economic policy during the presidencies of Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover favored deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, and high tariffs like the Ford-Macomber tariff, creating an environment of apparent prosperity that was largely built on speculative investment and the expansion of easy credit. This era of excess concealed systemic weaknesses in the American economy, including a prolonged depression in the agricultural sector due to falling crop prices and the overextension of consumer debt, which ultimately reached a catastrophic breaking point on October 24, 1929, known as Black Thursday, followed by the total collapse of the stock market on Black Tuesday. The ensuing Great Depression saw the unemployment rate soar to 25%, the failure of thousands of banks, and the total evaporation of personal savings, leaving millions of Americans in a state of destitution and homelessness, often residing in makeshift shantytowns known as Hoovervilles. The inability of the Hoover administration to provide direct federal relief based on his belief in rugged individualism and voluntary cooperation led to the landslide election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, who promised a New Deal for the American people, beginning with the first 100 days of unprecedented legislative activity that established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, to restore confidence in the banking system, the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, to provide employment for young men, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, to stabilize crop prices through subsidies. The Second New Deal, launched in 1935, introduced more radical reforms, including the Social Security Act, which created a national pension system and unemployment insurance, and the Wagner Act, which guaranteed the right of workers to organize and bargain collectively, leading to the rapid growth of the Congress of Industries Organization, CIO. While the New Deal successfully halted the economic failfall and provided a social safety net, it did not fully end the Great Depression, and by the late 1930s, the Roosevelt administration's attention was increasingly drawn toward the deteriorating international situation in Europe and Asia, as the rise of fascist regimes under Adolf Hitler in Germany and Benito Mussolini in Italy, alongside the expansionist policies of Imperial Japan, threatened the fragile peace established after the First World War.
As the 1930s drew to a close, the United States remained locked in a complex struggle between its commitment to isolationism, codified in the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937, and the growing realization that the expansionist triarchy of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan posed a direct threat to the democratic order. The German invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, initiated a global conflict that Franklin D. Roosevelt sought to influence through the policy of measures short of war, leading to the repeal of the arms embargo in favor of a cash-and-carry provision.
The fall of France in June 1940 catalyzed a shift in American public opinion, prompting the first peacetime draft in the nation's history under the Selective Training and Service Act and the subsequent trade of 50 aging destroyers to Great Britain in exchange for 99-year leases on British naval bases in the Western Hemisphere. By early 1941, Roosevelt further bypassed isolationist sentiment with the Lend-Lease Act, effectively turning the United States into the arsenal of democracy by providing unlimited military aid to nations deemed vital to American defense, primarily Britain and later the Soviet Union after the German invasion of the USSR in June 1941. Tensions in the Pacific reached a critical threshold as the United States implemented an oil embargo and froze Japanese assets in response to Japan's occupation of French Indochina, a move that the Japanese High Command viewed as an existential threat to their empire. The resulting surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, unified the American public and triggered a formal declaration of war against Japan, followed by declarations of war from Germany and Italy against the United States. The subsequent mobilization of the American economy was an industrial feat of unparalleled scale. The War Production Board and the Office of Price Administration managed the conversion of civilian factories to military production, while the great compression of wages and the massive entry of women into the workforce, symbolized by the cultural icon Rosie the Riveter, reshaped the domestic social structure. Scientifically, the secretive Manhattan Project, led by J. Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves, initiated the race to develop an atomic weapon, while the military strategy known as Germany First dictated that the bulk of American resources would be directed toward the European theater. The invasion of North Africa in Operation Torch in 1942 and the subsequent Italian campaign preceded the massive cross-channel invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, where Allied forces under Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower established a permanent foothold in Western Europe. Simultaneously, in the Pacific, the United States Navy and Marine Corps executed a grueling strategy of island hopping, reclaiming strategic outposts such as Midway, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima, gradually constricting the Japanese defensive perimeter. The death of Franklin D. Roosevelt in April 1945 elevated Harry S. Truman to the presidency, just as the war in Europe concluded with the surrender of Germany on May 8, 1945. Truman's decision to employ the atomic bomb against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 was motivated by the desire to avoid a projected 1 million casualties in a land invasion of the Japanese home islands, leading to the formal surrender of Japan on September 2, 1945. The end of the war did not bring a return to isolationism, but rather the dawn of the Cold War, a decades-long geopolitical and ideological confrontation with the Soviet Union over the future of Europe and the decolonizing world. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 established the policy of containment, pledging American support to nations resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures, while the Marshall Plan provided over $13 million in economic aid to rebuild Western Europe and prevent the spread of communism. The formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949 represented the first permanent military alliance the United States had entered during peacetime, cementing its role as the leader of the Western Bloc. Domestically, the post-war era was characterized by a massive economic boom, the passage of the GI Bill, which facilitated the growth of the middle class through education and home ownership, and the rapid expansion of suburbia, exemplified by developments like Levittown. However, this period of prosperity was shadowed by the Second Red Scare and the rise of McCarthyism, as Senator Joseph McCarthy exploited fears of communist infiltration in the federal government.
The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, further solidified the containment policy as American troops led a UN coalition to repel the North Korean invasion of the South, resulting in a stalemate that remains unresolved at the 38th parallel. As the 1950s progressed under the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the nation grappled with the contradictions of its democratic ideals, particularly regarding the systemic racial segregation upheld by the Plessy versus Ferguson precedent. The landmark 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka ruled that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, triggering a massive resistance in the South and launching the modern civil rights movement. Events such as the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, sparked by Rosa Parks and led by a young Martin Luther King Jr., and the forced integration of Little Rock Central High School in 1957, demonstrated the federal government's increasing, if often reluctant, role in enforcing constitutional rights. The space race, initiated by the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, spurred massive federal investment in science and education, setting the stage for the new frontier of the 1960s under John F. Kennedy, whose presidency would be defined by the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world ever came to nuclear war, and the escalating involvement in Vietnam, a conflict that would eventually tear the American social fabric apart. The assassination of John F. Kennedy in November 1963 placed Lyndon B. Johnson at the helm of a nation increasingly polarized by the demands of the civil rights movement and the deepening quagmire of the Vietnam War, leading to the enactment of the Great Society programs, which represented the most significant expansion of the federal social safety net since the New Deal. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 dismantled the legal architecture of Jim Crow, yet the slow pace of economic progress and persistent systemic inequalities contributed to a period of urban unrest in neighborhoods like Watts and Detroit, while the movement itself bifurcated between the nonviolent integrationist philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr. and the more militant separatist rhetoric of Malcolm X and the Black Power movement. Simultaneously, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964 granted Johnson broad authority to escalate military involvement in Southeast Asia, leading to a massive deployment of ground troops and the commencement of Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that failed to break the resolve of the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese Army. By 1968, the Tet Offensive shattered the illusion of American progress in the war, fueling a domestic anti-war movement that became inextricably linked with a broader counterculture defined by the rejection of traditional social norms, the rise of the New Left, and the advocacy for environmentalism, feminism, and gay rights, the latter of which was catalyzed by the 1969 Stonewall riots in New York City. The year 1968 served as a traumatic pivot point in American history, marked by the assassinations of King and Robert E. Kennedy and the subsequent election of Nixon, who appealed to a silent majority of Americans weary of social upheaval and pledged to achieve peace with honor in Vietnam through the policy of Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing U.S. forces while increasing the combat role of the South Vietnamese. Nixon's foreign policy, guided by Henry Kissinger, sought a pragmatic, realpolitik approach, leading to the opening of diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in 1972, and a period of détente with the Soviet Union through the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT-1. However, the clandestine expansion of the war into Cambodia and the revelation of the Pentagon Papers deepened public distrust in the government.
Sentiment that reached a crisis point with the Watergate scandal, involving a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters and a subsequent executive cover-up that eventually forced Nixon to become the first president to resign from office in 1974. The succeeding administration of Gerald Ford faced a stagnant economy characterized by stagflation, a combination of high inflation and high unemployment, exacerbated by the 1973 OPEC oil embargo, and the final chaotic fall of Saigon in 1975, which marked the definitive end of the American intervention in Vietnam. The election of Jimmy Carter in 1976 reflected a public desire for moral integrity in leadership, yet his presidency was besieged by the 1979 energy crisis, the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident, and the geopolitical humiliation of the Iran hostage crisis, where 52 American diplomats were held captive for 444 days following the Iranian Revolution. The rise of the New Right and the Moral Majority, a coalition of fiscal conservatives and evangelical Christians, culminated in the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, whose Reaganomics emphasized supply-side economic policies, including significant tax cuts, deregulation, and a reduction in social spending, alongside a massive military buildup designed to confront the evil empire of the Soviet Union. The Reagan era saw a shift in the Cold War dynamic, moving from détente to a renewed arms race with the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, yet it also facilitated a thawing of relations through Reagan's personal diplomacy with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, leading to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF. As the 1980s drew to a close, the internal contradictions of the Soviet system led to the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent dissolution of the USSR in 1991, leaving the United States as the world's sole superpower at the dawn of a new unipolar era. This transition was marked by the Persian Gulf War in 1991, where a U.S.-led coalition swiftly expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait, asserting a new world order based on collective security and international law. Domestically, the 1990s under Bill Clinton were defined by a period of sustained economic growth fueled by the digital revolution and the rise of the Internet, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and a shift toward centrist third-way politics, though the decade was also marred by intense partisan polarization, the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, which highlighted the threat of domestic terrorism, and the impeachment of Clinton in 1998. The turn of the millennium was fundamentally reshaped by the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, which prompted the George W. Bush administration to launch the global war on terror, leading to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq and a significant expansion of federal surveillance powers under the Patriot Act. The 2008 financial crisis, the most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression, facilitated the election of Barack Obama, the first African-American president, whose administration focused on the passage of the Affordable Care Act and the recovery of the global financial system, even as the nation remained deeply divided over issues of immigration, healthcare, and the role of government in an increasingly globalized world. The decade following the 2008 financial collapse was defined by a profound realignment of the American political and social landscape as the nation grappled with the long-term consequences of the Great Recession and the accelerating impact of the digital information age. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, while controversial, initiated a slow but steady period of economic expansion, yet the recovery was uneven, deepening the divide between thriving urban tech hubs and the struggling industrial heartland of the Rust Belt. This economic anxiety, coupled with the rapid demographic shifts of the early 21st century, gave rise to the Tea Party movement on the right and the Occupy Wall Street movement on the left, reflecting a growing populist disillusionment with established political institutions and the perceived influence of corporate interests. During the second term of the Obama administration, the domestic discourse was increasingly focused on issues of social justice and systemic inequality, as the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013 highlighted ongoing concerns regarding police conduct and racial bias in the criminal justice system. Simultaneously, the Supreme Court's ruling in 2015 in Obergefell v. Hodges legalized same-sex marriage nationwide, representing a landmark victory for the LGBTQ+ rights movement and a significant shift in the country's cultural consensus.
In the realm of foreign policy, the United States navigated a complex global environment characterized by the rise of the Islamic State, ISIS, in the Middle East, the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation in 2014, and the growing economic and military assertiveness of the People's Republic of China. The 2016 presidential election served as a definitive turning point as Donald Trump's America First platform tapped into the grievances of working-class voters who felt abandoned by globalization and traditional political elite, leading to a victory that challenged long-standing norms of American government and international engagement. The Trump administration was marked by a series of transformative policy shifts, including the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA, the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, and a focus on deregulation and judicial appointments that moved the federal courts in a decidedly conservative direction. The era was also defined by intense partisan polarization and the pervasive influence of social media as a primary source of political information, which exacerbated social fractures and led to frequent clashes over the nature of truth and the role of the press. This period of domestic tension culminated in the global COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, a public health crisis that claimed hundreds of thousands of American lives, triggered a sudden and severe economic contraction, and fundamentally altered the nature of work, education, and social interaction. The federal response, involving trillions of dollars in stimulus through the CARES Act, attempted to mitigate the economic damage, even as the nation remained deeply divided over public health mandates and the federal-state balance of power.
The social unrest following the death of George Floyd in May 2020 triggered the largest civil rights protests in American history, forcing a national reckoning with racial history and the role of law enforcement. The 2020 election of Joe Biden occurred against this backdrop of crisis and instability, characterized by an unprecedented challenge to the electoral process and the events of January 6, 2021, at the United States Capitol, which underscored the fragility of democratic institutions in an age of extreme polarization. The 2020 election of Joe Biden occurred against this backdrop of crisis and instability, characterized by an unprecedented challenge to the electoral process and the events of January 6, 2021, at the United States Capitol, which underscored the fragility of democratic institutions in an age of extreme polarization. The Biden administration's early years were focused on the distribution of vaccines, the passage of the American Rescue Plan, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which represented the largest federal investment in climate change mitigation in American history. On the global stage, the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 marked the end of the 20-year Forever War, while the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine prompted a renewed American commitment to European security and the revitalization of the NATO alliance. As the mid-2020s approached, the United States faced an era of rapid technological disruption driven by advancements in artificial intelligence and automation, alongside ongoing debates over the stability of the international order and the long-term sustainability of the American social contract in an increasingly fragmented and competitive global landscape. The maturation of the American project into the mid-2020s has been increasingly defined by the structural challenges of a post-industrial society grappling with the pervasive influence of artificial intelligence, the decentralization of traditional media, and the persistent internal debate regarding the scope of federal authority. As the global economy entered a phase of reconfiguration characterized by nearshoring and friendshoring, the United States saw a revitalized focus on domestic semiconductor manufacturing and green energy production, catalyzed by the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. This legislation aimed to secure American supply chains against the backdrop of heightened competition with China, particularly concerning the sovereignty of Taiwan and the control of critical technologies. The domestic political landscape, meanwhile, continued to be shaped by the aftershocks of the Supreme Court's 2022 decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned nearly 50 years of precedent established by Roe v. Wade and returned the authority to regulate or prohibit abortion to the individual states. This ruling sparked a legislative and electoral cascade, influencing state-level politics and national election cycles, and reinforcing a broader trend of judicial originalism that sought to recalibrate the relationship between the citizen, the state, and the federal government. Concurrently, the rise of large language models and generative AI systems in 2023 and 2024 introduced a new layer of complexity to the American labor market and educational system, prompting intense discussions in the halls of Congress and within the private sector regarding the ethical implications, intellectual property rights, and the potential for technological unemployment. These advancements coincided with a continued crisis in housing affordability and a widening wealth gap, issues that transcended traditional party lines and fueled a renewed interest in labor organizing, as seen in the high-profile strikes of the United Auto Workers and various entertainment industry guilds. The American demographic profile also continued its slow transformation, with the 2020s marking the decade in which the silver tsunami of retiring baby boomers reached its peak, placing unprecedented strain on the Social Security and Medicare systems and forcing a national conversation on the necessity of immigration reform to sustain the workforce. In the realm of public discourse, the fragmentation of the digital town square, accelerated by the volatility of major social media platforms and the proliferation of niche information silos, created a landscape where the shared American narrative became increasingly difficult to maintain.